start recording. So thank you for coming to the interview workshop. Basically, our agenda, we're going to go over a little bit of why schools are having the interviews, preparing the interview day itself, 2 new kinds of interviews that they're having, the multi-mini interviews, which a lot of schools are having, and then group interviews, which some schools are having, and then follow up after the interview. So I think sometimes people lose sight of the fact that of why schools are having the interviews. It is an expensive model to have everybody come for interviews. It's expensive for you, unfortunately. It's also expensive for the schools because they have to get students, they have to get researchers, they have to get a lot of people to complete these interviews. But it's really important to them that they learn about if you're a good match for the school, if you have obviously the people skills, the maturity to be a good physician. And then the other thing that some people kind of forget is that this is a recruiting day for them. So sometimes people come back and they're like, well, I don't know. It's like they were trying to sell me on this school. Yes, they're trying to sell you on this school. So some of you guys are going to get more than one offer of admission. I know it seems hard to believe at this particular moment, but you may get more than one offer. So remember, when you go to these schools, you're interviewing them as well. So you really want to make sure that you're asking those questions, that when you're getting your school tour, that you're really thinking about, would I be happy here? What things do I like about this school? What things are important to me in a school, and will I find them here? Do the students that I meet seem happy here? So really do a good assessment, because if you 6 months later are in a position where you're like, well, okay, I have 2 schools to choose between, you want to really make sure that you have, things to think about. So after your interview, you want to make sure to write things down. You want to really think about questions that you want to know the answers to. So don't just ask questions because you think they're the right question. And also remember, they're not, obviously they want to know that you have good grades, that you have a good MCAT score, but they can see that from your application. So they're looking for some of those softer skills from those AAMC competencies, social skills, cultural competence, teamwork, communication, maturity, capacity for improvement. So those are the things that they're trying to assess in an interview. Preparation for an interview is really key. Go over every single thing that you wrote in your application. If you did something your freshman year, you volunteered at, Pure Health Exchange, it could just happen that whoever it was that is interviewing you also volunteered there. So you want to be able to talk about, why did you volunteer there? What was the mission of the program? What did you contribute to it? And what did you gain from it? So big picture, you want to be able to talk about the importance of all of your experiences, your research, your volunteer work, your clinical. Make sure you have some stories about things. You don't know what the one thing is that somebody might have in common with you. And sometimes I've heard a lot of people say that they've sat down with a researcher and the researcher is planning their first marathon and they just happen to be a runner. So they'll start talking about running, for example. So you want to really make sure that anything on your application, even if it was something small that you did a long time ago, you can talk about in detail. You never know if, maybe they're on the board of that organization and they're like, ooh, that'll be interesting to hear the insiders or the student or the volunteer's perspective. Make sure that you can articulate your strengths. Don't assume that the interviewer will have access to your application. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Think about your committee letter interview. Think about the questions that we asked you. If there was anything that you were like, oh, I should have had an answer to that. Think about an answer to that. So these are some of the things that the schools are kind of looking for. And again, I'll be posting this presentation so you don't need to feel like you have to write all of this down. But think about answers to, some of these questions. A lot of schools will ask you questions about clinical, and you can, rather than just talking about clinical, bringing in a story from a clinical experience is a really good idea. At Northeastern, people get so used to, oh yeah, I volunteered at MGH, or, I did clinical research at the Brigham, that you tend to forget that a lot of other people who aren't in Boston or aren't at Northeastern don't have the same experience that you have. So really pulling in your research experience, your clinical experience, your volunteering, and giving specific stories, concrete examples is a really good way to being able to illustrate some of the questions that they'll ask. So, have a few stories that can help you talk about, social determinants of health or interprofessional care. Have a few different stories that you think illustrate a few points, and that will help to bring you a step above some of the other people who are interviewing, because they're not going to have had the opportunity for that exposure. And then finally, in terms of preparation, make sure to look at the schools, go over their website. You want to be able to give 4 or 5 reasons why you want to go to each particular school. And with that, you want to be able to talk about it from different angles, depending on who you're talking to. If you're talking to a student, you might talk from one angle, from the student's perspective. When you're talking to a professor, you might talk from another angle. When you're talking to a researcher, a clinician, an admissions person, you might say things a little bit differently. But you really want to make sure that you're coming at it from the same, so that when the 4 people sit down and they're saying, well, this person was great, they just knew all about us, you sound like the same person when all 4 people are talking about you. And again, contact us about the alumni mentors, and definitely do contact those alumni mentors and, get feedback from the spreadsheet. So when you're thinking about, I think this is kind of obvious, you do this, I think, in your co-op interviews, but you really want to talk about, what clinical experiences you have had, and talk about it in relation to, what population is the school particularly invested in serving. So if you're interviewing at a school that's particularly invested in serving urban populations, and you've had some volunteer experience in the Boston area or some work experience in the Boston area, it's not that you're going to leave out other experience, but when you're talking about your clinical experience, you're going to start with, in the urban setting, I did X, Y, and Z. And then I also have the opportunity to do blah, blah, blah. So you want to frame what you're talking about in the terms of what the school's interests are. Of course, you want to talk about everything that you've done. You don't want to leave out things that you've done just because it's not on their page of, well, these are the things that are important to us, because what you've done is, in general, all important to them. Okay. You also want to make sure to go over details of the school's website and of the school's academic information, and kind of look at what do they offer in terms of student services. A lot of this stuff is good stuff to, kind of get a sense of from the students, if you're able to stay with a student host. If you really can't find information about this and you have a question, that's a good question to ask them. Some people maybe are interested in MD, PhD or MD, MPH, but they're not completely sure, and they think, well, what if I wanted to transfer into that program after my first year? Is that an option? A lot of you guys I know are interested international opportunities. So really having the time to look at, what are the international opportunities? And, if you see that they have them, asking specific questions about those opportunities and, what are students able to do? So reviewing the specifics of what they have on the website, asking more in-depth questions is always a really good idea. Finally, you really want to make sure to practice. And again, I think this is one of the places that the co-op system puts you guys well ahead of other schools because you do have a lot more experience. You want to practice for those typical questions that you may get. So, for example, things that you were asked by us, practice answering questions out loud. There is this really good program, Interview Stream, that you have access to as a Northeastern student and alumni. Basically, this is offered through Career Services. It will ask you questions, and you can set it up to ask you pre-med or medical school interview questions, and it'll record your answers, and then you can watch them. So you can get a sense of, am I talking too long? Am I not talking long enough? Am I saying, do I have a nervous twitch? So it's a really good idea to, do a few practices. You can do practice interviews also at Career Services. They do phone or Skype appointments as well. It's also good to, just do some practice interviews with people you know. We're particularly fond of suggesting that you do a practice interview with somebody you're a little scared of and want to impress, because that's who you'll be interviewing with. Have them ask you 3 or 4 questions. Dr. Begley and I do take some notes at your committee letter interviews, so you may get an email from one of us saying, by the way, you may want to tighten up your answers a little bit, or by the way, you probably want to elaborate a little bit, tell a story, something like that. So if you do get an email from one of us and you want to come in and do some practice interviewing with us, that's certainly something that you're more than welcome to do as well. You guys did really well in your committee letter interviews. There's, of course, always room for improvement, so a little bit of practice is definitely a good idea. So yeah, viewing your taped interview. One of the things that you really want to watch is, do you exude confidence, enthusiasm? And, schools really look for people who are excited to be there. So you want to look excited to be there. It's fine to seem really happy. I know I've heard people at schools say, I would rather see somebody sweating, or, some people get like red splotches on their face when they're nervous. They said, I'd rather see that than see somebody who doesn't care that they're here, because we've given them this interview and that means we didn't give it to somebody else. So we hope they're excited to come to our school. So, look excited, even if it's, if you're really nervous, that's fine. They expect you to be nervous. So don't stress too much about the nervousness, but try and contain it in a way that is, as much as you can, without making yourself seem bored or arrogant or flat. Because sometimes when people are containing that anxiety too much, that's how it comes across. If you're asked about a deficiency, they do say try and turn a negative into a positive, but don't be too obvious about it. If they ask you for a weakness and you say, I'm too organized, they're not going to buy it. So you really want to try and talk about something that is maybe not your greatest strength, but then also talk about, well, but this is how I handle it. This is how I deal with it. This is how I work with it or address it, so that they can see that this is not something that's going to be a problem for you. And finally, you really want to bear in mind that for these people who are interviewing you, they're assessing future colleagues. So you really want to come across as somebody who they want to have in their medical school. They want to be teaching. They want to, be studying with late at night. For a lot of The student interviewers, they'll be teaching you 2 years down the road. And so they want to know you're going to be enthusiastic and excited to be taught. And then finally, when you're looking over your interviews and when you're thinking about your co-op interviews, and actually for folks who are still working at their co-op positions, this is a really good question to ask your supervisors. What did I do really well? You guys typically have gotten some really competitive co-op positions, which means that you've done better at your interviews than some of your peers. So ask them, why did you hire me? What was it about me? And try and make sure to emulate that at your interviews when you go in for those medical school interviews. In terms of the big day for the interviews, if you get an interview invitation, remember these may get filtered to your junk mail, so definitely be checking your junk mail. Make sure to respond quickly to that invitation. Even if you go in, you look at the interview dates that are available and you're not going to be able to make a date for a while, you still want to show enthusiasm and excitement about that interview. The way that the traffic rules work for MD programs, the first day that they can accept students is October 15th. For dental programs, it's December 1st. For DO programs, there really isn't a specific traffic rule. They can accept people pretty much any time, and they will actually start accepting people in September, which is really nice for the DO people because they may have an answer in September. For the September accepts, though, for DO programs, they do ask for a non-refundable deposit, which is typically pretty large, like $2,000. So it's a double-edged sword. But if you get in to those early interviews, it can be a real bonus for you because it can mean that you're going to get accepted sooner. So it doesn't necessarily hurt to choose an earlier interview. Now, that said, not all schools accept people on October 15th. Again, it's a recruiting tool for them. So, they may think, well, if we accept these people on October 15th, they may, get excited about coming here. They may have 6 months where they're like, yeah, I'm going to such and such a school. And so when they get another accept, say in March, they may decide they don't want to go there. A lot of the schools don't send out any acceptances until March. So you really, again, after the interview, you have to kind of put yourself in that mindset, okay, this may be a while until I hear back. So just kind of keeping that in mind. But anyway, we're not up to that point yet. The big day, remember to dress professionally and conservatively. You don't want to stand out for what you're wearing. You want to stand out for what you're saying and for how smart you are and how awesome you are, not because of your outfit. So the clothes, the purse, all of that should blend in. Ladies, if you enjoy wearing heels, I would definitely recommend bringing flats along because a lot of the schools, they do have a tour and then there's a lot of walking and, you could be doing a lot of walking. And for folks who are traveling to interviews, if you're staying at a hotel, a lot of the schools will have a safe room. So if you have a suitcase, for example, you can contact the school. Usually you can, if you have to check out of your hotel, usually you can leave your suitcase there. So you can check with the school about that. So on the day of the interview, you want to arrive early. I say aim for arriving 30 minutes early because you never know if traffic will be bad. You don't want to make yourself more anxious worrying about getting there on time. If you can do a dry run the day before or the week before, that's a great idea. If you can't, obviously you can't. Don't go in until about 10 minutes early, just because, they're frantically trying to set up. They don't want to be pressured by having people come in. So get there early, but just, find a place to sit, go over your notes, not nervously. One thing that somebody told me that they did, and I know it sounds really cheesy, but it's very effective, is they wrote 10 positive things about themselves before they went in so that they had those positive vibes in their head before going into the interview instead of going in feeling anxious or worried. So I recommend that as a strategy for you. Turn off your cell phone. I recommend, if you can, just leave it behind you. Leave it at the hotel. Don't bring it in. Leave it in your purse. You do not want to be on your cell phone at any point during the interview. I mean, you can be in the bathroom and somebody can hear you from the next stall. It's better not to be on your cell phone. And I know I have heard admissions people say, oh, I come in here to start the day, everybody's sitting here texting, and I want them to be looking at me, talking, looking excited and happy to be here, and they just look like they're texting and not at all excited. No gum. You guys did pretty well with this year. I saw a lot of people in a different year showing up to committee letter interviews with gum in their mouth, and you guys know better, so that is good. On the big day, make sure you guys know this also, but be courteous. I would say within a 10-mile radius of the medical school, be courteous to everyone. A lot of the schools, the administrative assistants are on the interview, the selection committee, and if you've been rude to the admin, if the administrative assistant has your phone number memorized, you are not getting in. So just be polite and courteous. Don't overdo it, but just be friendly and polite. Pay attention to your body language, smile. Biggest thing, act confident, show enthusiasm, be yourself. Don't try and be anyone else. Just be yourself as much as possible. When you're on a tour, walk near a student guide and ask them a few questions. During the interview, answer questions openly and honestly. Remember, I think Dr. Begley and I say this a lot, don't focus on tasks, focus on what you contributed and what you learned. So focus on the big picture. What you're going to be doing as a physician is not what you've been doing as a co-op student or during your work. What they want to know is that you have the skills and the abilities that you're going to need moving forward. It's okay to pause if you don't have an answer. It's okay to say, oh, that's a good question. Let me think about this for a second. Ask them questions. Make sure to have a few questions to ask different people, but avoid asking questions that are on the website that will make people feel defensive or uncomfortable. So ask questions that are going to lead to a positive conversation and dialogue between you and the interviewer. And a lot of the time people have said, we sat down, we started chatting. They didn't really have time to ask me any of their pre-formatted questions, but other times people will say, they had a strict list of questions and we went through them. So you really can't expect one way or the other what the interviewer will do, and you can't know from how they ask their questions what that means about your interview. So multi-mini interviews, now this is a new type of interview. And with the multi-mini interviews, most people from Northeastern who have gone on multi-mini interviews have actually found that they prefer them to regular interviews. Basically, the way multi-mini interviews work, there are like 6 to 10 stations. Each of the stations, they're typically in a hallway with like a examining room hallway. And on the door of each room is a question. You read the question, you have about 2 minutes to read over the question, and then you go in the room and you answer the scenario. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that can play out. Sometimes you go into the room and there's a actor or actress who's a standardized patient in there, and so you actually have a scene that you play out. Sometimes there's a question that you have to give an answer to. Sometimes it's your traditional, tell me about yourself question. Other times it's, they're trying to get at some area, maturity, ethics, diversity, your experience in a clinical setting, your clinical skills. Now, obviously, they're not going to expect that you have the clinical skills that you would have as a physician. They're trying to get the sense of, are you comfortable around people? Are you comfortable around patients? And there are a lot of different ways that they can ask these questions. So the question could be a scenario, you're on a boat and the boat is going down and there are 8 people on the boat, and, they describe the boat and you only get to save 6 of them. Who are you going to save? There's not a right answer to that, but what they want to know is your thought process and your reasoning and who you're deciding you're going to save. So what they want to understand is, how do you think about this problem? Who do you save? Not so much, obviously 2 people are not being saved, so there's not a right answer, but how are you considering the value of a life, for example? So walking them through that process and explaining that to them. How do you interact with the actor in the room? Sometimes there will be a scenario where you have to make a decision and they'll present more evidence to you as you're going through the decision. And, they're really trying to assess, well, how long does it take you to change your mind? And what kind of evidence does it take to make you change your mind? Does it take empirical data? Does it take, just somebody saying, well, I don't think that's right? So, what sorts of things does it require? Are you completely inflexible? Are you somewhat flexible? So, they can be pretty intense. The nice thing, though, about the multi-mini interviews is that, number one, you're going to have, between 6 to 10 scenarios. So you're going to have a whole bunch of different types of questions to answer. If one of them's not your best type of question, you've got a whole bunch of others to answer. As opposed to if you're meeting with an individual, most traditional interviews, you meet 2 people. If you don't get along with one of those people, you don't hit it off for whatever reason, or that person is having a bad day for whatever reason, that can be difficult for you. So the MMIs tend to be fairer. Everybody's getting the same question. What they do is they have a rating scale, so from 1 to 6. And that after your interview, after your, whatever it is, 6 minutes, 6 to 8 minutes, the person in the room gives you a rating between 1 to 6. At the end of all of your stations, they add up the scores, and that's your score. So if you had one room that was just a little bit lower, it's not the end of the world. It uses statistical sampling to determine how you do on the interviews. So if you have one number that's a little bit lower, but the rest are higher, you're still going to wind up with a score that's higher, as opposed to somebody who gets kind of lukewarm scores all along. So one of the things that's kind of key with the MMI interviews is that after each room, you have to let it go. So you exit the room. If there's something that you're like, oh, I should have said this, or oh, I can't believe I said that, you got to let it go. Move on to the next room. What's happened has happened, and you have to move forward. So that's something that's really key with these interviews. I think another thing is that a lot of the MMI questions have some ethical component to it. Your grandma is terminally ill. She's really scared of losing control and of, sort of the end coming. And since you're now a physician, she wants at that point for you to give her a dose of medication that's going to help her die. What are you going to do? So, when you get a question like that, you're going to have your opinion about what you should do. What's important, there are a few things that are important. There's more than one side to that issue, and you really want to make sure to examine both sides of the issue and then give your opinion on where you are on that issue. Now, in this particular scenario, in most states, it's illegal for you to, help grandma to die. So presumably that's not something that you're going to be doing. But at some level, you have to be able to relate to that wish. And then kind of go from there. Well, this is what I see as my opinion. Some of the ethical judgments, though, may be a little bit, more two-sided in where you can come down. The same with a lot of the decisions about the Affordable Care Act. So you really want to understand, well, what is the Affordable Care Act? Obviously, you're not going to read the entire thing because nobody is, but some of the general premises and how that's going to affect your life as a physician, and then giving, more than one side of it and having an opinion yourself is really important. So showing that you can understand other people's perspectives, but then also, well, this is where I see myself in terms of this issue. Okay. It's, with the different schools and with these questions, they're trying to assess something with each of these questions. So with, the question about, are you giving your grandma the fatal overdose, they're trying to assess your ethics. So you want to be asking yourself, what's the question behind this question? What are they trying to assess here? If you go into a room and there's an actor in there and you're giving them the news that they've got 8 months to live, for example, what are they trying to assess? You've never given somebody the news that they're dying before. They're going to teach you about that. They're trying to assess your social skills and your maturity. And they're trying to get a sense of, is this something that in the future you would have the ability to do with training? So don't be too worried about the fact that I don't know what to say, but what you want to do is use those skills that you've gained from being in the clinical setting and do your best with it and be comfortable with the silences, or be as comfortable as you can. Some of the actors are really good, so be as comfortable with crying or hysterics or however they're going to react. You have to expect that if there's an actor in the room, they're going to be a pretty good actor and they're not going to step out of character. So be ready to expect that. Okay, you can do some Googling of MMI questions, and there are some questions out there on the internet that you can kind of look over. I have heard from some schools that you might get the same MMI questions at 2 different schools, but they could be looking for different things in their responses. So the best thing to really do is to spend some time reading up on healthcare, the current issues in healthcare, thinking about your position on ethics in healthcare, and thinking about some situations that you've been in with healthcare providers. So some of those shadowing experiences or times that you've been with physicians and you've seen them interact with patients. What have you seen that you've been like, oh, that was really amazing that they did that? So again, think about those different scenarios, write them down, and just kind of think about them to use for your interviews. And then all that stuff from your self-assessment, all those things that you said you learned, all those things from your research, go back to those as well and think about, okay, what have I learned from those? So now with the group interviews, Again, different format, same goal. There are a bunch of different formats for that. A lot of the time with the group interviews, what they'll have is a few different people interviewing and a few different interviewees. They're trying to figure out, how well do you play in the sandbox. Usually what they'll do is they'll ask each person a question for several questions. So they'll have the interviewees lined up in a row, and they'll ask one person one question, another person another question. They may be asking you different questions based on what is on your application. So you may not get the same question, but it's not going to be like a free-for-all where they ask a question and, you don't have a chance to answer because another person is answering. So you will have a time when everybody answers, and then usually they end with a group problem-solving exercise, something along those lines, because they want to see how well you work with other people. So from what I've heard of people who have done these group interviews, they tend to go pretty well because everybody wants to show that they're a good team player. So you don't want to take over the group activity. You want to make sure to listen to the other people, smile and nod, seem like you're friendly. If there is somebody in your group who is really kind of taking over, don't worry about it too much because they don't want that applicant there. They want people who get along well. That's why they're having a group interview. So after the interview, send personalized thank yous to each individual. Spend a little bit of time on it. It does take a little bit of time to write a good thank you note. It should be short and concise and refer to something that you talked about in the interview. Restate a specific reason for your interest. If the school is your first choice, say so, but don't say that it is if it isn't your first choice. You don't have to say, well, this isn't my first choice, but I guess I would go here if I didn't get in anywhere else. But, you want to sound enthusiastic and positive about the program. Again, share your feedback about the school with your peers. And this is just, I asked a bunch of people, what do you think helped you get accepted into medical school? And this is the advice that I got from successful applicants who went before you. So I think, a few things to really focus on. Don't try and be anyone other than yourself. Don't try and be somebody you think you should be. Don't worry about the length of the interview. If you're doing a traditional interview, they say that you make up your mind about a person in like 3 minutes. So if you have a 10-minute interview, it may just be because the person has met you and been like, yeah, they're terrific. I love them. I'm going to do my best to fight for this person at our meetings. Oh yeah, look at the time, I got to go. So it doesn't necessarily mean anything if your interview is long or short. So don't stress over that. And some interviewers actually will come across as, they'll disagree with what you say, or they'll be kind of assertive or aggressive. And that also is just an interview technique. They're trying to see, how do you handle it when somebody isn't just really nice to you. It seems to happen a lot less than it once did. But if somebody is being like that, it's typically not that they, they don't agree with you. It's just that they're trying to see how you handle the pressure. So just go with it. Don't take it personally. Just answer the questions. Try not to get flustered at all, because they're just testing to see, do you get flustered under pressure? So that's one other piece. And then the last thing that I would mention is just in terms of timeline, because this is something that comes up a lot. It's really hard to know in terms of timeline, and that's the next piece that I think makes people really anxious. Some of you may have interviews already. I know that one school, I think it was GW, or it was either GW or Georgetown, already sent out a bunch of denials. And I know last year BU did that also, that if you get a denial from one of those schools, it doesn't mean that you're not getting in anywhere. It just means they're looking at their list of applicants and they're thinking, oh my goodness, how do we go through all of these? Okay, let's get a bunch of them off our plate. We don't think that these students are necessarily going to be the best fit for us. We're going to deny them. It's got nothing to do with, are you ever going to get into medical school? It just means that for that particular school, the admissions committee didn't think that you were a fit. So there will be other schools. One thing that's really important to remember in your head, that you're going to get more denials than acceptances, even the most successful person, and that's okay. So you really want to focus on those interviews that you're getting offered. For some people, you aren't going to get offers until January, and you can still wind up with 2 or 3 acceptances. So there's not a specific timeline for success, unfortunately, and that makes it really stressful for people, I know. Some schools don't send out invitations until a little bit later. Some send them out gradually. Some schools have a very transparent system for telling you when they're sending out acceptances. Some send them out, after their meetings, but they don't tell you when those meetings are. A lot of the Ivy schools don't send out any acceptances until March, so you may not hear from them until March. UMass tends to send out their acceptances very late, so they may not send their acceptances out until April, so you may not hear from them. I know that sometimes people will wind up being waitlisted, and so they won't get in until, May off of a wait list, and that's fine. It doesn't feel fine at the time, but when you start in school next August, you're going to be no different than any of the other students. They love the people that they put on the wait list. I know they've said that. I've been to conferences and I've heard them, admissions committees, talking and saying, we would love it if we could accept more students, but we just can't. So if you're waitlisted at a school, it doesn't mean that you're never going to get in. And that's sort of one last thing. Again, after an interview, you want to send them a thank you. You don't want to be in touch with schools every single day, every single week. You don't want the administrative assistant to know your phone number. But if something important happens and you want to send them an update, that's fine. Sending thank you notes via email or via mail. I think either mail or email is fine. I would sort of tend more towards email as opposed to mail, just because they're going to be looking for them. And regular mail tends to be slower. So it may take them a while to get it, and they may be thinking, oh, I didn't get a thank you from this person. Well, what's up with that? So by the time they get it, they'll be like, oh, okay, she did send one. But there tends to be among people that expectation of sort of immediate gratification. So sending it via email is a good idea. I would also say send an update via email if you have an update. If you don't have an update, but you just want to check in, every couple of months, just to say, I still really love this program. I know you're going through the decision-making process, but I just want to reiterate my interest in you. Don't be doing that all the time, but just so that they know, I've interviewed with you. I really liked your program when I interviewed there. I'm still really interested in your program. It's fine to check in with them every now and then, every couple months, just to say, I just still want to say really interested. If you have a school that's your favorite school, that is the school that you would absolutely go to if you were accepted, tell them that one school and only that one school. Oh, question. Do we need to ask for their email addresses? A lot of the places, they will give you the contact information, so they usually try and make it easy for you to send those emails. If for whatever reason, like they'll give you their business card or they'll give you a list of who you're meeting with, if for whatever reason you don't get that information, or you're writing stuff down, somebody does a presentation and you're like, oh, that was a really good presentation, I really want to send a thank you. You can ask the admin, the person at the front desk, do you happen to have that person's contact information? They're really helpful there. Like everybody I've met at the schools has been wonderful. They want to help you to put your best foot forward, so they're typically happy to give you that information so that you can send a thank you. So that's kind of the overall presentation. I don't know if anybody has any additional questions about anything going forward. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you, everyone, for coming.